The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Master Chief Sarah Rodriguez adjusted her tactical vest one final time before stepping out of the armored vehicle. At 32, she had spent 8 years proving herself in the most elite circles of the military, but today would test everything she had learned. The village of Marja lay before them like a sleeping giant. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Taliban fighters had taken control 3 days ago, holding dozens of civilians hostage in the local school. Women and children were trapped inside, used as human shields while insurgents prepared for what they knew would be an inevitable confrontation with American forces. Rodriguez commanded a mixed team of Navy SEALs and Army Rangers, 24 of the most highly trained soldiers in the world. But as they surveyed the scene through their scopes, even these battle-hardened warriors felt the weight of an impossible situation. The school sat in the center of the village, surrounded by narrow alleyways and mud-brick buildings that provided perfect cover for enemy fighters. "Ma'am, we've got movement on the north side," whispered Sergeant Martinez, his voice crackling through the radio. "At least 6 hostiles, maybe more." Rodriguez studied the tactical map spread across the hood of their vehicle. Every approach route led through a deadly funnel of crossfire. The Taliban had chosen their position well. Any conventional assault would result in massive casualties, both military and civilian. Lieutenant Commander James Walsh, her second-in-command, moved up beside her. Walsh had served 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. His men respected him, and he had initially questioned the decision to put Rodriguez in charge of this operation. Not because she was a woman, but because her background was in military intelligence, not direct combat operations. "Sarah, I'm looking at this from every angle," Walsh said quietly, using her first name despite military protocol. "There's no clean entry point. They've got overlapping fields of fire on every approach." Rodriguez nodded, her mind racing through possibilities. She had graduated top of her class from the Naval War College, earned a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies, and spoke fluent Pashto and Dari. But none of that seemed relevant now, facing an enemy that had turned innocent civilians into a weapon against them. The radio crackled with updates from reconnaissance teams positioned around the village perimeter. "Overwatch 1, we've got visual on approximately 40 civilians inside the school. Mixed ages, mostly women and children. Overwatch 2, confirming 6 to 8 military-age males with automatic weapons positioned at windows facing the main road." Rodriguez closed her eyes for a moment, filtering out the tactical chatter around her. In that silence, she remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago, back in their small Texas border town. Her grandmother had been a curandera, a traditional healer who served both Mexican and American communities without regard for politics or borders. "Mija," her grandmother had said, "sometimes the strongest weapon is not the one you carry in your hands, but the one you carry in your heart." At the time, Rodriguez had dismissed it as the kind of folk wisdom that had no place in modern warfare. But standing here, facing an impossible tactical situation, those words suddenly carried new weight. She opened her eyes and looked at her team. These men had trained for every conceivable combat scenario. They could breach buildings, neutralize threats, and extract hostages with surgical precision. But this situation demanded something different, something that couldn't be taught in any military academy. "Walsh, I need you to pull the teams back 50 meters and establish a defensive perimeter," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned her respect throughout her career. "Ma'am?" Walsh looked confused. "We haven't even begun our approach." "That's correct. We're not approaching." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of goats bleating and dogs barking in the village. Rodriguez could feel the eyes of her entire team on her, waiting for an explanation that she wasn't sure she could provide. "I'm going in alone," she said finally. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Walsh stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sarah, that's not tactical. That's suicide." Petty Officer First Class Davidson, one of the SEAL team leaders, moved up to join the conversation. Davidson had earned his reputation in some of the most dangerous operations of the past decade. His men called him the Ghost because of his ability to move unseen through enemy territory. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my teams are trained for this exact scenario," Davidson said. "We can create diversions, use smoke, and flashbang grenades to confuse them, then breach simultaneously, from 3 directions." Rodriguez shook her head. "And how many civilians die in the crossfire?" Davidson's jaw tightened. He knew the answer as well as she did. In a confined space like the school, with that many non-combatants present, even the most precisely executed assault would likely result in significant civilian casualties. "So what's your alternative?" Walsh asked. Rodriguez looked toward the village where thin streams of smoke were beginning to rise from morning cooking fires. She could see movement in some of the windows, faces peering out cautiously before quickly disappearing. These people had been caught in the middle of a conflict they didn't choose, and their only crime was living in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I'm going to walk up to the front door and ask them to let the hostages go," she said. The silence that followed was so complete that Rodriguez could hear her own heartbeat. Around her, 24 of America's most elite warriors stared at her, as if she had just announced her intention to sprout wings and fly to the moon. "Ma'am," Davidson said carefully, "that's not a tactical solution. That's what?" Rodriguez interrupted. Davidson struggled for words. In all his years of training and combat experience, he had never encountered a situation where walking directly into enemy fire was presented as a viable strategy. "That's insane," Walsh finished for him. Rodriguez smiled for the first time that morning. "Maybe, but sometimes insane is exactly what the situation requires." Rodriguez began removing her tactical gear piece by piece. First came the ceramic body armor plates, each one weighing several pounds and capable of stopping rifle rounds. Then her tactical vest with its array of ammunition pouches, grenades, and communication equipment. Her teammates watched in stunned silence as she methodically stripped away the tools of modern warfare. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing?" Walsh demanded, his voice rising despite their proximity to enemy positions. She held up a hand for silence while continuing to disarm herself. The M4 carbine came next, along with her sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226 that had been her constant companion for 3 years. The combat knife followed, then the fragmentation grenades that every soldier carried as weapons of last resort. Within minutes, Rodriguez had transformed from a heavily armed special operations commander into something that looked almost civilian. She wore only her desert camouflage uniform, stripped of all tactical attachments, and a pair of dusty combat boots. "I'm evening the odds," she said simply. Petty Officer Davidson stepped forward, his face flushed with frustration. "Ma'am, you can't seriously be considering walking into a hostile situation completely unarmed. It goes against every principle of tactical operations we've ever learned." Rodriguez looked at him calmly. "Tell me, Davidson, how many hostage rescue operations have you participated in where the hostage takers were willing to die for their cause?" Davidson considered this. "Most of them, ma'am. That's what makes them so dangerous." "And how many of those operations resulted in 0 civilian casualties?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Every man present knew the answer. Even the most successful hostage rescue operations typically resulted in some civilian deaths, often called acceptable losses in military planning documents. "That's different," Davidson said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Rodriguez asked. "Or is it just the way we've always done things because we've never considered that there might be another approach?" She walked over to the communications equipment and picked up the radio headset. "Command, this is Rodriguez. I'm implementing an alternative tactical approach to the hostage situation." The voice that crackled back through the radio belonged to Colonel Peterson, their commanding officer back at base camp. Peterson was old-school military, a man who had earned his rank through 3 decades of following established protocols. "Rodriguez, explain your alternative approach." "Sir, I'm going to attempt peaceful negotiation." The pause that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. When Peterson's voice returned, it carried the weight of military authority backed by years of experience. "Negative, Rodriguez. You have a full tactical team at your disposal. Use them." Rodriguez looked at her men, Then at the village where smoke was still rising from morning fires. Somewhere in that school, children were probably crying for their mothers. Mothers were probably holding those children close, whispering prayers in Pashto that American soldiers wouldn't understand but would recognize in their hearts. Sir, respectfully requesting permission to try negotiation first. Permission denied. Execute standard hostage rescue protocol immediately. Rodriguez set down the radio and walked back to where her team was assembled. She could see in their faces the conflict between their training and their growing understanding of what she was trying to accomplish. Ma'am, Sergeant Martinez said quietly, if you disobey a direct order, you're looking at court-martial. Career over, probably prison time. Rodriguez nodded. She understood the consequences better than any of them. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to reach her current position to throw it away lightly. But as she looked toward the school where innocent people waited in fear, she realized that some things mattered more than career advancement. I know, she said simply. She began walking toward the village. Behind her, she could hear urgent whispers among her team members. They were trying to decide whether to follow orders and support her unauthorized mission or stick to military protocol and stop her. Ma'am, wait, Davidson called out. Rodriguez stopped and turned back. Davidson was holding her sidearm, the weight of it seeming heavier in his hands than it ever had in hers. If you're going to do this, he said, at least take some protection. She shook her head. That defeats the purpose. The moment they see a weapon, they'll assume I'm there to fight. But if something goes wrong, then something goes wrong, Rodriguez said with a slight smile. But at least we'll have tried something different. She resumed walking toward the village, leaving her team behind with their weapons, their training, and their growing understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in military history. The first 100 meters passed without incident. Rodriguez walked openly down the main road, making no attempt at stealth or tactical movement. Her boots crunched on the gravel and sand, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. At the 200-meter mark, she saw movement in a window of a building adjacent to the school. The dark barrel of an AK-47 appeared briefly, before disappearing again. She kept walking. 300 meters, 400. The school was now clearly visible ahead, a simple concrete structure painted in faded yellow and blue. She could see sandbags positioned at several windows and the shapes of armed men moving behind them. At 500 meters, a shot rang out. The bullet struck the ground 10 feet in front of her, sending up a small puff of dust. Rodriguez stopped walking but didn't retreat. Instead, she raised both hands above her head in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. A voice shouted something in Pashto from the direction of the school. Rodriguez's language training allowed her to understand most of it. Stop, go back, or we will kill you. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted back in Pashto, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. I want to talk. I am unarmed. Another shot, closer this time. The bullet struck the ground less than 5 feet away. Rodriguez felt her heart rate increase, but she forced herself to remain calm. Fear would accomplish nothing except getting her killed. Behind her, nearly a kilometer away, 24 elite soldiers watched through their scopes as their commanding officer stood alone in the middle of an open road, facing down an unknown number of enemy fighters with nothing but her voice and her courage. Jesus Christ, Walsh whispered, his finger hovering over the trigger of his sniper rifle. She's really doing it. Rodriguez stood perfectly still for several minutes, her hands raised above her head. She could feel the crosshairs of multiple weapons trained on her, but she forced herself to breathe slowly and maintain her composure. In the distance, she could hear voices arguing in Pashto from inside the school. The argument seemed to center around what to do with this strange American soldier who had walked into their trap completely unarmed. Some voices advocated for shooting her immediately. Others seemed curious about her intentions. A few suggested that she might be carrying hidden explosives, making her approach some kind of suicide mission. Rodriguez decided to take advantage of their confusion. She lowered her arm slowly, making sure her movements were deliberate and non-threatening. Then she took another step forward. This time, no shots came. Encouraged, she took another step, then another. She was now close enough to see faces in the school windows, young men with beards and intense eyes, their fingers resting on the triggers of assault rifles. When she was approximately 100 meters from the school entrance, a door opened. A man emerged, keeping his rifle trained on her while using the door frame as partial cover. He was older than the others she had glimpsed in the windows, perhaps in his 40s, with gray streaking his black beard. Rodriguez recognized the signs of military bearing in the way he moved and positioned himself. This wasn't a farmer or shopkeeper forced into fighting by circumstance. This was a professional soldier, someone who understood tactics and strategy. The man shouted something in Pashto. Rodriguez listened carefully, then responded in the same language. "My name is Sarah Rodriguez. I command the American soldiers. I want to speak with your leader about the people inside." The man's eyes widened slightly at her fluent Pashto, but his rifle remained pointed at her chest. He called back toward the school, and Rodriguez heard rapid conversation from inside. After a few moments, another man appeared in the doorway. This second figure was clearly in charge. He was younger than the first man, perhaps in his early 30s, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. His clothing was different too, cleaner and of better quality than typical Taliban fighters. Rodriguez suspected he might be from outside the immediate area, possibly a regional commander sent to oversee this operation. The leader studied her for several long moments, then said something to the man with the rifle. The first man lowered his weapon slightly, though he kept it ready to fire at a moment's notice. "You speak our language," the leader said in Pashto, stepping partially into the open. "I studied your culture and your language because I respect your people," Rodriguez replied. "I did not come here to fight." The leader laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You lie. You came with soldiers and weapons to attack us." "I came with soldiers, yes. But I sent them away. I came to you alone because I believe we can find a solution that does not require bloodshed." "Americans always speak of solutions," the leader said, "but your solutions always involve our deaths." Rodriguez could see additional faces appearing in the school windows, not just fighters but women and children. The hostages were being allowed to see this strange conversation between their captors and an American officer who had walked into certain death to speak with them. "I have a daughter," Rodriguez said quietly. "She is 7 years old. When I leave for deployments, she asks me why people have to fight. I never know what to tell her." This was true. Rodriguez's daughter lived with her ex-husband in San Diego, and their conversations before deployments were among the most difficult moments of Rodriguez's life. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes adults solve their problems by killing each other? The leader's expression shifted slightly. "You have children?" "One daughter. Her name is Maria. Why do you tell me this?" Rodriguez took a small step forward. The man with the rifle tensed, but the leader held up a hand to stop him from raising his weapon. "Because," Rodriguez said, "some of the children in that school are the same age as my daughter, and some of the women in there are mothers, just like I am a mother. They are afraid, and their fear is the same as the fear my daughter feels when she hears explosions in the night." The leader considered this. Behind him, Rodriguez could hear murmuring from inside the school, the voices of the hostages who were clearly listening to this unprecedented conversation. "You think because you speak our language and tell us about your daughter, we will simply release our prisoners?" the leader asked. "I think," Rodriguez said carefully, "that you took these people not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you wanted to protect yourselves from my soldiers. You needed something to make us think twice before attacking." The leader's silence confirmed that she had guessed correctly. "But now I am here," Rodriguez continued, "and I have sent my soldiers away. You no longer need the people inside to protect you from an attack that is not coming. How do I know you speak the truth? How do I know your soldiers are not moving into position while we talk?" It was a fair question, and Rodriguez had anticipated it. She reached slowly into her pocket, causing both men to tense, but she moved with deliberate care to show that she was retrieving something harmless. She pulled out a small radio, Not the military communication device she had been using earlier, but a simple two-way radio of the type available in any electronics store. She held it out toward the leader. "This radio is tuned to the frequency my soldiers are using," she said. "You can listen to their communications and hear for yourself that they are holding their position." The leader looked suspicious, but he gestured for the man with the rifle to take the radio. The fighter approached cautiously, snatched the device from Rodriguez's hand, and retreated quickly. For the next several minutes, the two Taliban fighters listened to the radio chatter from Rodriguez's team. The conversations they heard confirmed exactly what she had claimed. The American forces were maintaining a defensive perimeter and making no aggressive moves. Rodriguez could see the leader processing this information. His entire tactical situation had just changed. Instead of facing an imminent assault by superior forces, he now had time to consider his options. "Why should I trust you?" he asked finally. Rodriguez looked directly into his eyes. "Because I trusted you enough to walk here unarmed." The simple truth of this statement seemed to resonate with both men. In a world where violence was the default response to conflict, Rodriguez had chosen to make herself completely vulnerable. It was either an act of incredible courage or incredible foolishness, and they were still trying to decide which. "What do you propose?" the leader asked. For the first time since beginning her walk toward the school, Rodriguez allowed herself to feel a small measure of hope. Rodriguez took a deep breath before responding. She knew that her next words would determine whether dozens of innocent people lived or died, and whether her unprecedented gamble would succeed or end in disaster. "I propose that you release the women and children immediately," she said in Pashto. "In exchange, you and your men have safe passage out of the village. No pursuit, no airstrikes, no retaliation." The leader's eyes narrowed. "And then what?" "We leave. And tomorrow more American soldiers come to search every house, arrest every man who might have helped us?" It was another astute question. Rodriguez realized she was dealing with someone who understood the broader implications of any agreement they might reach. This wasn't just about the immediate hostage situation. It was about the cycle of violence that defined the relationship between American forces and Taliban fighters. "What is your name?" Rodriguez asked. The leader hesitated, then said, "I am called Ahmad. Ahmad, I cannot promise you that this war will end today. I cannot promise you that there will be no more fighting in this province or this country. But I can promise you that if you release these people safely, I will personally ensure that this village is left alone for the next 30 days. No raids, no searches, no arrests. 30 days, Ahmad repeated. And then you have 30 days to convince your people that there is a better way than using children as shields." The bluntness of her statement caused both men to stiffen, but Rodriguez pressed on. "You are a commander, Ahmad. I can see it in how you carry yourself, how the other man defers to you. You have influence with your people. Use these 30 days to show them that Americans can keep their word." Ahmad looked toward the school where faces were still visible in the windows. Rodriguez followed his gaze and realized that some of those faces belonged to his own fighters, who were listening to this entire negotiation. "My men will think I am weak if I simply let you walk away," Ahmad said quietly. "Your men will think you are smart if you get them out of an impossible situation without any of them dying," Rodriguez countered. "How many fighters do you have in there?" Ahmad didn't answer, but Rodriguez could see in his expression that the number was smaller than her team had estimated. Intelligence reports often inflated enemy strength, and she suspected they were facing fewer than 10 Taliban fighters rather than the 20 or 30 originally projected. "I have 24 of the most elite soldiers in the American military positioned around this village," Rodriguez continued. "They have training and equipment that your men have never seen. If this becomes a battle, some of your fighters will die. Maybe all of them. And some of your soldiers will die too," Ahmad replied. Rodriguez nodded. "Yes, some of mine will die too. And when the shooting starts, some of those children in the school will die. Maybe many of them." She paused to let this sink in, then continued. "Or you can be the commander who chose to save lives instead of taking them. You can be the man who was strong enough to walk away when walking away was the harder choice." Behind Ahmad, Rodriguez could see movement in the school. Some of the women inside had moved closer to the windows, and she could hear the faint sound of children crying. The stress of the situation was taking its toll on the hostages, and everyone present understood that time was working against any peaceful resolution. "If I agree to your proposal," Ahmad said, "how do I know you will honor the 30-day agreement?" Rodriguez reached into another pocket, again moving slowly to avoid startling the armed men. This time she withdrew a small piece of paper and a pen. "I will write the agreement down and sign it," she said. "You keep one copy, and I keep one copy. If American forces violate the agreement, you can show your copy to any journalist or aid worker or United Nations representative." The idea of a formal written agreement seemed to intrigue Ahmad. In his experience, Americans made promises easily, but rarely put them in writing where they could be held accountable. Rodriguez knelt down and began writing on the paper, using her knee as a makeshift desk. She wrote in both English and Pashto, creating a simple but clear agreement. American forces would refrain from operations in this village for 30 days, following the safe release of all hostages. In exchange, Taliban forces would leave the EO area and refrain from using civilians as human shields in future operations. When she finished, she tore the paper in half and handed one piece to Ahmad. "This is my word written down. If I break it, you can show this to the world." Ahmad read both versions carefully, comparing the English and Pashto text to ensure they said the same thing. Rodriguez was impressed by his thoroughness. Many fighters in his position would have been unable to read either language fluently. "You understand," Ahmad said, "that I cannot control what other commanders do in other villages." "I understand. And you understand that I cannot control what other American units do in other provinces. But we can control what happens here, today, between us." Ahmad folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his shirt. Rodriguez could see him weighing his options, considering the lives of his fighters against the strategic value of the hostages. From inside the school came the sound of a child crying loudly, probably a very young child who didn't understand why they couldn't go home. The sound seemed to affect Ahmad more than all of Rodriguez's arguments combined. "I need to speak with my men," Ahmad said finally. "Of course." Ahmad turned and walked back toward the school entrance, speaking quietly with the man who had been covering him with the rifle. Rodriguez remained in position, her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. For several minutes she could hear heated discussion from inside the school. The voices were too distant and muffled for her to make out specific words, but the tone suggested that not all of Ahmad's fighters were pleased with the direction of the negotiations. During this time, Rodriguez became acutely aware of her own vulnerability. She was standing in the open, surrounded by potential enemies, completely dependent on Ahmad's ability to control his own people. If just one of his fighters decided to shoot her, the entire situation would collapse into the kind of violence she was trying to prevent. She forced herself to remain calm and focused on the sounds around her. Birds were singing in the trees that lined the village streets. Somewhere in the distance, a goat was bleating. These normal sounds of daily life seemed surreal against the backdrop of armed standoff and life-or-death negotiations. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, Ahmad emerged from the school again. This time, he was followed by 2 other fighters. All 3 men carried their weapons, but Rodriguez noticed that the barrels were pointed toward the ground, rather than in her direction. "My men have agreed to your proposal," Ahmad said, "but they have conditions." Rodriguez felt her heart rate increase. Conditions could complicate everything, potentially making an agreement impossible to reach. "What conditions?" she asked. Ahmad looked back at his fighters, then turned to Rodriguez with an expression she couldn't quite read. "They want to know that you will not use aircraft to follow us when we leave." Rodriguez nodded immediately. "Agreed. No helicopters, no drones, no aircraft of any kind. And they want your word that no American soldiers will enter this village for the full 30 days, not just that there will be no raids." This was a more significant request. Rodriguez knew that patrols regularly moved through rural areas, and promising to avoid an entire village for a month would require coordination with multiple units and commanders. "I can agree to that," she said after a moment's consideration. But I will need to communicate with my superiors to make sure all American units in this area understand the agreement. Ahmad translated this for his men, and Rodriguez could see them discussing it among themselves. Finally, one of the fighters, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, stepped forward and spoke directly to Ahmad. Ahmad listened, then turned back to Rodriguez. This one says he does not trust American promises. He says Americans always lie. Rodriguez looked at the young fighter, seeing in his eyes the kind of hatred that came from personal loss. She suspected he had lost family members in the conflict, possibly in American airstrikes or raids. "What is his name?" she asked Ahmad. "He is called Rashid." Rodriguez addressed the young man directly in Pashto. "Rashid, you are right not to trust easily. Trust must be earned. I ask you to give me the chance to earn your trust by keeping this agreement." Rashid responded angrily, his words coming so fast that Rodriguez had to concentrate to follow them. He spoke of brothers killed in a drone strike, of a village destroyed by artillery, of promises broken by previous American commanders. When he finished, Rodriguez was quiet for several moments. Then she said, "I am sorry for your loss. I cannot bring back your brothers, and I cannot undo the harm that has been done, but I can choose not to add to that harm today." The simplicity and directness of her response seemed to surprise Rashid. He had expected excuses or denials or military justifications. Instead, he received acknowledgement of his pain and a promise to avoid causing more. Ahmad spoke to Rashid quietly, and Rodriguez could see the young man's posture beginning to relax slightly. Whatever Ahmad was saying seemed to be having an effect. "Rashid agrees to the conditions," Ahmad said finally. "Now we must discuss the details of release." This was the moment Rodriguez had been both hoping for and dreading. The mechanics of releasing 40 hostages while ensuring the safety of both the captives and their captors would be complex and dangerous. "How do you want to do this?" she asked. "The women and children will come out first in small groups. When they are clear of the building, my men and I will leave through the back." Rodriguez considered this plan. It made tactical sense from Ahmad's perspective. He could maintain control of the situation until the last moment, then escape while American attention was focused on caring for the released hostages. "Where will you go?" she asked. Ahmad smiled for the first time during their conversation. "That is not something I will tell you." "Fair enough. But I need to know that you won't take any of the villagers with you as guides or supplies. We need nothing from these people. We came here only because American soldiers were approaching, and we needed a place to make a stand." This confirmed Rodriguez's earlier assessment that the hostage situation had been driven by tactical necessity rather than ideology. Ahmad and his men had been cornered and had used the school as a defensive position, not because they wanted to hurt civilians, but because they needed to protect themselves. "When do we begin?" Rodriguez asked. Ahmad looked at the sun, which was now approaching its midday position. "We will release 5 women and children every 10 minutes. When all civilians are free, we will leave." Rodriguez did a quick calculation. With approximately 40 hostages, the release process would take more than an hour. That was a long time for things to go wrong, but it was also methodical enough to minimize confusion and panic. "I agree," she said, "but I need to return to my soldiers first to explain the plan. They need to be ready to receive the hostages and provide medical care if needed." Ahmad nodded. "You may go. But remember, if your soldiers move closer to the village or take any aggressive action, the agreement is broken." Rodriguez understood the implicit threat. Ahmad was trusting her to control her own people just as she was trusting him to control his. She began the long walk back to where her team was positioned, leaving the 3 Taliban fighters standing in front of the school. With each step, she felt the weight of what she had just accomplished beginning to settle on her shoulders. Behind her, nearly a kilometer away, 24 elite soldiers watched through their scopes as their commander walked back from what should have been certain death. The radio chatter among her team was a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and professional concern about the tactical situation. "I can't believe she actually did it," Davidson whispered to Martinez. "I can't believe they didn't shoot her," Martinez replied. "Walsh, monitoring the situation through binoculars, keyed his radio. "Sarah, what's your status?" Rodriguez's voice came back clear and calm. "Mission accomplished. We have an agreement for the peaceful release of all hostages." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of someone whistling softly, a sound of amazement that no amount of military training could suppress. "Copy that," Walsh said finally. "What do you need from us?" "Medical team standing by for potential casualties, transportation for approximately 40 civilians, and absolute discipline. No one moves. No one takes any action that could be interpreted as aggressive. This is going to work, but only if everyone follows orders exactly." As Rodriguez approached her team's position, she could see the expressions on their faces changing from skepticism to something approaching awe. These men had witnessed something unprecedented in their military careers, a successful negotiation with enemy forces that resulted in the peaceful resolution of a hostage crisis. But the hardest part was still ahead. The actual release of the hostages would require precise coordination and absolute trust between enemies who had been trying to kill each other just hours before. Rodriguez checked her watch. In 10 minutes, the first group of civilians would walk out of that school, and her promise to Ahmad would be put to its first test. Rodriguez quickly briefed her team on the negotiated agreement, watching their faces as they processed the unprecedented situation. These were men trained for direct action and overwhelming force, and the concept of trusting enemy fighters to honor a verbal agreement challenged everything they had been taught. "Ma'am," Davidson said carefully, "what if this is a trap? What if they're planning to use the hostage release as cover for an attack?" Rodriguez understood his concern. Military doctrine emphasized assuming the worst-case scenario and preparing for treachery. But her instincts, honed by years of intelligence work and cultural training, told her that Ahmad was genuine in his desire to avoid bloodshed. "It's not a trap," she said with quiet confidence. "Ahmad could have killed me at any point during our conversation. If he wanted a fight, he would have taken it when I was standing alone and defenseless." Walsh checked his watch. "First group should be coming out in 8 minutes. What's our positioning?" Rodriguez pointed toward a cluster of buildings about 300 meters from the school. "Medical team there, with transportation standing by. Everyone else maintains current positions with weapons lowered. I repeat, weapons lowered. If Ahmad or his men see rifle barrels pointed at them, they'll assume we're planning to shoot them the moment the hostages are clear." This order created visible tension among her team. Lowering weapons in the presence of enemy fighters went against every tactical principle they had learned. But Rodriguez's calm authority and the success of her initial negotiation had earned their trust. "Copy that, ma'am," Davidson said, though his voice carried obvious reluctance. The next few minutes passed in tense silence. Rodriguez maintained radio contact with the medical team and transportation units, ensuring that everything was ready for the arrival of potentially traumatized civilians. Some of the hostages might be injured, dehydrated, or in shock from their ordeal. At exactly the agreed time, the front door of the school opened. 5 figures emerged, 3 women wearing traditional Afghan clothing and 2 small children, one of whom appeared to be no more than 5 years old. The group moved slowly across the open ground between the school and the edge of the village, clearly frightened but unharmed. Rodriguez watched through binoculars as American medics approached them carefully, speaking in Pashto and offering water and medical assistance. "First group clear and accounted for," Walsh reported. "No injuries visible, but they're obviously scared." 10 minutes later, the second group emerged. This time it included an elderly woman who needed assistance walking and a teenage girl carrying an infant. Again, the transfer proceeded smoothly, with American personnel maintaining their distance until the civilians were well clear of the school. As the process continued, Rodriguez began to notice something remarkable happening among her team. The initial skepticism and tension were gradually being replaced by professional admiration for the precision and trust involved in the operation. "Ma'am," Martinez whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. They're actually keeping their word." By the fourth exchange, Even the most dubious members of Rodriguez's team were beginning to accept that Ahmad was genuinely committed to the peaceful resolution. Each group of hostages that emerged safely reinforced the idea that sometimes trust could accomplish what force could not. The final group included the last of the children and several women who appeared to be teachers from the local school. As they walked to safety, Rodriguez felt a profound sense of relief mixed with anticipation. The most dangerous moment was still ahead, when Ahmad and his fighters would have to leave their defensive positions and trust that American soldiers wouldn't shoot them in the back. "All hostages are clear and accounted for," Walsh reported. 42 civilians total, including several who weren't on our initial count. No serious injuries, though some are dehydrated and all are obviously traumatized. Rodriguez keyed her radio to the frequency Ahmad had been monitoring. "Ahmad, all civilians are safe and receiving care. You and your men may leave as agreed." For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the back door of the school opened, and Rodriguez could see figures moving through the alleyways behind the building. Ahmad had chosen his exit route carefully, using the narrow passages between buildings to avoid open ground, where his men would be vulnerable. Through her binoculars, Rodriguez caught a glimpse of Ahmad himself as he paused at the edge of the village. For a moment their eyes met across the distance, and he raised one hand in what might have been a salute, or simply an acknowledgement of mutual respect. Then he disappeared into the landscape, followed by his fighters. "Targets are clear of the area," Davidson reported. No visual contact. Rodriguez felt something she had rarely experienced in her military career, a sense that violence had been avoided not through superior firepower or tactical advantage, but through simple human communication and mutual respect. "Stand down to normal patrol posture," she ordered. "Mission complete." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound. Slow, deliberate clapping. Rodriguez turned to see Petty Officer Davidson applauding, his rifle slung across his shoulder and his face showing an expression of genuine admiration. "Ma'am," Davidson said, "I've been doing this for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished." One by one, the other members of her team began to join in the applause. These were men who had earned their reputations through courage under fire and precision in combat operations. But they recognized that what Rodriguez had done required a different kind of courage. The courage to walk unarmed into enemy fire, trusting that human decency could overcome the machinery of war. Walsh walked over to where Rodriguez was standing, still watching the spot where Ahmad had disappeared. "Sarah, what you did today, it's going to change how people think about these situations." Rodriguez shook her head. "It only works if both sides want it to work. Ahmad could have chosen differently at any point. But he didn't," Walsh said, "and neither did you." As the team began the process of securing the area and caring for the rescued hostages, Rodriguez reflected on what had just occurred. 42 innocent people were going home to their families instead of becoming casualties of war. A group of enemy fighters had chosen trust over violence and had been proven right in that choice. But perhaps most importantly, 24 of America's most elite warriors had witnessed an alternative to the cycle of violence that defined modern warfare. They had seen that sometimes the most powerful weapon was the courage to put down all weapons and simply talk to another human being. 3 weeks later, Rodriguez received a message through unofficial channels. It was written in Pashto on a piece of paper that had clearly been handled many times. The message was brief. "The children ask about the American woman who kept her word. We remember." It was unsigned, but Rodriguez knew it was from Ahmad. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her personal files, next to a photograph of her daughter Maria. Both documents served as reminders of why she had chosen to walk into that village, unarmed, and why sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the right thing to do. The official after-action report listed the operation as a successful hostage rescue with 0 casualties on all sides. But the men who had been there that day understood that they had witnessed something far more significant, proof that even in the midst of war, humanity could still triumph over hatred.